The other day, I had seen a movie that was from a propaganda film from the Nazis. And as I watched it, I was really overwhelmed at how sickening it was. It was just amazing how this convulsion of insanity came out of these people for the purpose of control. And as we were having this conversation, it inspired me to remember something that I had been going through for the last year and a half, and that was the revelation and the realization that even though we live in this horizontal plane between men, and anti-Semitism and the whole concept of anti-Semitism is basically an idea that is men against men doing wicked things for the purpose of accomplishing, darkness or hatred or violence. We're not getting the big picture. The big picture is far more dramatic, far more important to understand than just what is taking place in the natural. And that is the dynamic that this is an ancient war. This is a war that's been taking place for way beyond our comprehension of time. It's actually been taking place from before what we know as the universe, where we can look through telescopes and look into microscopes, and the concept of understanding this which is physical and tangible. Long before this came into existence, there was a falling out. There was a massive rebellion that took place in the kingdom of heaven. And that was when Lucifer himself, who was the greatest of God's creations, who covered the throne of God, he was this unbelievable, I can't even imagine the beauty of who he was, because God calls him one of his greatest creations. He was a musical instrument. He led worship. He inspired the worship of God, and he covered the throne of God. I can't imagine what this creature looked like and who he was. And yet he became envious and he became jealous towards God, and he wanted what was God's and God's alone. And when he rebelled, when he fell, he created a dynamic that would ripple throughout not just the heavenlies, but it would ripple throughout time. And God meted out a judgment. God determined a judgment there. As Scripture says that Yeshua was crucified before the foundations of the world, before the whole dynamic of what we understand as creation existed. It was already done. It was already taken care of. It was already acted out. The gavel had already been brought down. And Lucifer knew his end. He understood it. And of course he led a massive rebellion. A third of the host of heaven went with him and entered into this rebellion with him. And God created man in his image, because Lucifer at the time would have been God's greatest creation. He would have been the most magnificent, the most beautiful, the most awe-inspiring. He was just something that nobody had any idea of. We can't even conceive of such beauty. And yet God did something even greater, and it was going to be through his greatest creation that he was going to bring the final destruction of Lucifer. And God created man in his own image. He created this being that was the only thing in all of creation that was in the image of God. And it's interesting about man from a scientific perspective. He has one molecule in his genome, in his DNA, that is different, and it's uniquely to him, and nothing else in all of creation that anybody has ever found has, and that is called HAR-1. It is one molecule, and it's unique. And it separates him from everything else. And I personally believe that is a piece of who God is, and that's what makes him in the image of who God is. So, in the concept of anti-Semitism, in the idea of this thing that we see taking place, it's been the same dynamic that's been going on since the beginning, since the garden. Because Lucifer knew, he had an understanding of what he had done. He understood what he had done. He had the full understanding of what God's judgment was against him, and that judgment was a permanent judgment. It wasn't a judgment that was going to fail. It was going to come to pass. And when he saw Adam and Eve in the garden, he understood who they were. They were a type of a deliverer. Because it was through them that he was going to bring the end of Lucifer. He was going to bring the destruction of Lucifer through them. And so Lucifer, in his devious and twisted brilliance, understood that if he could get them to fall in the same way that he did, if he could get them to enter into his rebellion, God would wipe them out. He would finish them, and there would be no continuation. But when they fell, which was an agenda of hell, it was a dark, dark deed. When he got them to enter into that rebellion, at that point he assumed that it would be over, yet God had another story. God had another way. God was going to show mercy. He was going to show grace. He was going to show forgiveness. And he was going to bring his son regardless. And so the story is a story of a series of deliverers that would come through time. And so the next attempt was to destroy through Cain and Abel. Lucifer inspired Cain to kill Abel, which was the seed, because he's always trying to kill the seed, the DNA. He was trying to prevent that DNA from transferring all the way down to where the ultimate would take place, which would be the coming of Yeshua. So throughout time, every time a deliverer would come, he would try to completely destroy that seed. And of course, we're talking about a war that's been going on since way beyond anything that we can conceive of. And it's for the purpose of the destruction of man, or the seed that would bring the ultimate deliverer, which is Yeshua. So when you get to the end of the book of Genesis, you have the story of God telling Moses his own story. Moses, you're a deliverer. And the same dynamic that took place in the garden and took place with Cain and Abel and actually took place in a grand scale with Noah is the same thing that took place when darkness inspired the mind of Pharaoh through the idea that the deliverer had been born amongst the Hebrews, is to kill all the seed bearers, right? So that's exactly what he did. And then story goes forward all the way through, although there are other ones along the way. The story goes all the way forward to Yeshua's birth, and it's the exact same story gets played out. So there's this constant inspiration, this convulsing of darkness. You know, the dark ones, the fallen ones come and they inspire the mind to get rid of that which is the potential for deliverance, which is not just deliverance for man, but it is the demise of Lucifer. The story, in its grand scale, is not just the salvation of man, through Yeshua's work on the cross, but it's actually the finish of Lucifer once and for all, because Lucifer is the inspiration for all of this. And so when Yeshua comes, the same dynamic takes place that happens with Moses. He inspires Herod. Herod goes and kills all the male children in Bethlehem. It's the exact same story. It's a spiritual war. This is an ancient war. It's a war that's a war in the heavenlies. It's not a war that's done. It looks like it's happening in a horizontal state, and there's dynamics that are definitely real. We don't want to deny that. But we're talking about an inspiration that comes from the ones who were fallen. The principalities and the powers and the ones that Paul talks about who dwell in heavenly places. And they use the demonic world, and they inspire human beings to enter into their rebellion and their darkness and their wickedness. So there comes one last one, and that is, it comes through the prophetic words that Yeshua himself says when he talks about the fig tree coming into existence, and the ones who see the fig tree coming back to life. Because in Mark, you have the story where he curses the fig tree, and all the apostles, they see the fig tree one day, and then they come back the next day, and he curses it because it wasn't bearing any fruit, and it's a metaphor, it's a picture, and that tree dries dries up and it dies. And yet he says, when you see the fig tree come back and it blossoms, he's speaking to something that was going to take place, and he was talking about Israel coming into existence and the rebirth of Abraham as a nation in the earth. So when Abraham is reborn in the earth after thousands and thousands of years of not being a nation, because even when Yeshua was here, Israel was not a nation. It was not the nation of Israel. Rome was in control. It was known as Palestine, and that at that time it was completely disconnected from Israel as a nation, and had been for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years at that. Lucifer knew that prophecy, and also that Jerusalem coming out of the hands of Gentiles. Those words were so strong that when the possibility of this even taking place, of the time coming when Israel could become a nation, Lucifer knew it, and he inspired not just Hitler, but he's inspired many throughout time to conspire together for the purpose of the destruction of the Jews. That's what he wanted. He was trying to kill the seed. It's, again, the deliverer. Because the rebirth of Abraham in the earth, and the birth of the nation of Israel, and the restoration of the language, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the confirmation of the word being intact, and all those things meant the end. They meant the demise of Lucifer. His time was short at that point, once the nation came into existence. Darkness didn't just use people like Hitler and Stalin and Lenin. It had been planted in a seed in a book in 700 AD by Muhammad for the purpose of wiping out the seed, just like God had said that Ishmael would be this consternation against brother dynamic long back during the times of Abraham. I mean, so you've got something that was as ancient as that, was also percolating underneath the surface. It hadn't come to the surface yet. So when one thing failed, boom, the next one takes off. And you see Hitler with the Grand Mufti, you see this dynamic taking place, but nobody really understands what all that means in its fullness until after World War II. And all of a sudden you have the rise of the PLO, you have Yasser Arafat in the 50s, suddenly where that fails, now you've got another dynamic, and here comes the whole dynamic of Islam, the Quran, the calling for the destruction of the Jews again. And when Israel became a nation in 1948, we think of everything from a horizontal perspective, but there's a vertical dynamic taking place. There's something that's overarching. There's something that's taking place in the heavenlies that is sinister and dramatic, and it's inspiring all this. It's using the demonic world to influence and inspire minds that are given over and aren't given to God, and it's inspiring them for the purposes of destruction and trying to destroy the potential of that which would bring Yeshua back.